I am Anne-Laure Decombeix and I am a paleobotanist here in Montpellier in France. And I have a very cool job. I study fossil plants from different time periods and different parts of the world. So today I'm not going to talk to you about polar dinosaurs, but about polar plants. Plants that were growing in Antarctica at the start of the Mesozoic during the Triassic period. And we're going to see how we can find fossil plants in Antarctica, what type of fossil plants we can find. And I will also explain how we can study them and what they are telling us about the past vegetation of Antarctica. This is a work that I am doing with a lot of colleagues from around the world. But the core of the group that I am working with is in the States at the University of Kansas. There they have a really big collection of fossil plants from Antarctica. This is the result of numerous expeditions there that were funded by the National Science Foundation. So when we think about Antarctica, we really don't think about fossil plants. We think about penguins or seals or snow. There are a few lichens, for example, that grow in some of the warmest parts of the coast. But otherwise, there's really no vegetation there today. Of course, you can guess this has not always been the case. And something that I've always found really amazing is that more than 100 years ago, the first explorers of Antarctica, they already found and collected some fossil plants. Some of these guys didn't make it back home, but the fossils that they collected were sent to museums. They were studied by paleobotanists like me. And more than 100 years ago, people already realized that at some point in the past, Antarctica had been covered by forests. Today, we know that the climate was different, especially during the late Paleozoic and during the Mesozoic. The global climate was warmer than today. And we know that Antarctica had more temperate conditions and that it was part of a big supercontinent. The plants that were growing there, some of them became fossils, and their remains can be found today in the central Transantarctic mountains. This is a range of mountains that goes across Antarctica, and it's really great because these mountains are high. They're high enough that they rise above the ice sheet that covers Antarctica today. So if you manage to go in these mountains, you are above the polar cap, and you can actually find good fossil exposures from the Permian, from the Triassic, from the Jurassic. And you can find some really well-preserved fossil plants there. Of course, the thing is you have to go to these mountains in Antarctica first. I have been there 4 times with the US Antarctic program, and the first step is to go to New Zealand. From the US, New Zealand is quite far away. From France, where I live, New Zealand is almost on the other side of the world. So you start your trip by going to the other side of the world. Once you're in New Zealand, you get issued your ECW clothing. This is your extreme cold weather clothing to survive the conditions in Antarctica. Once you have this clothing and the weather is good enough, you can board a plane, and it's a few hours flight to McMurdo Station. McMurdo is a US base in Antarctica. It's actually located on a small volcanic island right off the coast of Antarctica. And when you arrive there in McMurdo, there is absolutely no fossil plants to find. It's a bit disappointing, but it's a very important step of your trip. This is where you get all your equipment or your gear for the field or your food. And this is also where you get some training, especially if it's your first time there. You learn how to set your tent, how to deal with the cold, what to do if there's a problem in your group, how to use the radios, all this. Once all your gear is ready and you've done all your training, you are ready to move on to the next step, going to a field camp. And you basically have two options. You can join a big field camp with several research groups, and then you can have up to 70 or 80 persons in your camp. Another thing that we have done is set up a small camp, for just your group. And then you have maybe 6 to 10 persons in your camp. Whatever the type of camp you're going to, you fly from McMurdo with all your gear. You arrive, you set up your tent. If it's a small camp, you actually set up the whole camp for your group. And then once you've settled, you are ready to go hunting for fossil plants. Depending where you are and where are your localities, where are the places you want to explore, you can go there flying with a helicopter or a plane, or you can just walk and explore around your camp. Now, Antarctica is extremely beautiful, and I'm sure you've seen very nice photos with a great blue sky. But it is often extremely cold. It is also often extremely windy. And remember that we are working at high altitude. We are in the mountains. So these are often very harsh conditions that we are working in. It can be quite tiring. And this is especially true if you are lucky and you find a lot of fossil plants that you have to carry back in your backpack. What type of fossil plants are we finding? What are we putting in our backpacks? A first type of fossil that we find is what is called compressions. This is probably the type of fossil plants you are thinking about most of the time. It's like what happens when a leaf falls into water. It is covered by sediments, it's compressed. This is what we call this a compression. And you have a nice 2D structure that is preserved in the rock. There's another type of fossil that we like to work with, and this is called permineralization. What is this? This is what happens when your plant remains fall into water that is very rich in minerals. And the minerals infiltrate the plant tissues and they preserve them in 3 dimensions. This means that the anatomy of your plant is actually preserved. You have the anatomy of a 200 million years fossil available. Of course, you don't see the anatomy just looking at the fossil. You have to prepare it so you can look at it under the microscope. We can cut a very small slice of the fossil, glue it on a slide, and then we grind it until it's completely transparent. And then we can look at it under the microscope. There's another type of preparation we can do with some very well-preserved fossils. We put acid on the surface, and this is going to dissolve the minerals preserving the plants, and you're going to be left with just the cell walls that are still composed of organic matter. You put a sheet of acetate on it, and you can transfer the remains of the cell wall on this. This is what we call a peel section. And again, you can look at this under the microscope and see details of the anatomy. We can find different parts of the plants, of course, preserved like this with the anatomy. Wood is very common, but in Antarctica we also find fossil peat, so ton of different pieces of plants that have been preserved together in 3 dimensions. It's a bit like a Triassic compost, if you want, with a lot of different parts of plants. So this is really exciting, but you're starting to wonder. We are mostly finding isolated pieces of plants, just a leaf here, a piece of wood there, and this is true. A big part of our job is actually to reconstruct the plants from different separated pieces. This is especially true if you work with fossil trees. If you think about a tree today, it's going to produce a lot of leaves and seeds and pollen during its life. It has a long life. And all these pieces of plant, they're going to be dispersed. And they can enter the fossil record at different times and in different places. This is all a bit like if you had several dinosaur remains at one locality and all the skeletons or the bones were mixed. And your job is to find which head goes with which leg, where is the tail of this one. This is a big part of our job. So of course we've been able to do this for several types of plants from the Triassic of Antarctica. And one of them is a tree, a conifer, a relative of the conifers that we still have today. It is called Telemachus. And for this Telemachus conifer, we have very nice trunks, we have roots, we have leaves, we have the different types of cones, female cones and male cones. So we can reconstruct this conifer, know what it looked like, details of its anatomy. We know it's a conifer, we know it's related to some other groups. We can actually do more than that thanks to the exceptional preservations that we have in Antarctica. For example, for this conifer, we have some leaves with very typical scars on them. And these scars indicate that at some point an insect laid their eggs on these leaves, and it left very typical scars that we can still observe today. So we have evidence of interactions between the plants and the insects back in the Triassic in Antarctica. This conifer from the Triassic of Antarctica, Telemachus, it also had some amazing features of its root system. One thing we realized is that when you look at the roots of this conifer, you see that some of them were producing little sucker shoots. And this means that if the main trunk of the plant was damaged, it was able to resprout from the root system. This is quite amazing to be able to observe this about the ecology of a tree that has been extinct for 200 million years. There's even more about the root system of this tree. When we look at the anatomy of the roots, we find some small nodules, and inside the cells that form these nodules, we find remains of fungi, small preserved hyphae of a fossil fungi. Today, we still have conifers who do that. They produce small nodules in their root systems, and these nodules are houses for symbiotic fungi. So we have the same type of association that we can record back in the Triassic, symbiotic fungi living inside the nodules of the root system of a conifer. So this is pretty amazing. Of course, this conifer was not the only type of plant that was growing in Antarctica during the Triassic. There were other types of trees, and a very common type was the corystosperms. This is an extinct group. We don't find them anymore, unlike the conifers. But in the Triassic, in the southern continents, they were very abundant. And in Antarctica, we actually have evidence of several species of these plants with very different types of leaves that belong to the genus Dicroidium. So conifers, corystosperms. We also have evidence that ginkgos were present in the Triassic of Antarctica. And in addition to these trees, of course, we had smaller plants in the understory. We have evidence of ferns, a lot of different ferns. We also have sphenopsids. Sphenopsids are plants related to the horsetails. We have a very small cycad. It's really cute. It's been reconstructed. It's called Antarcticus. And we also have several groups of plants that are now extinct, seed plants, including one that is very interesting and is called the Petrylales. We worked on this group a few years ago, and they were small plants with dissected leaves. They produced a lot of tiny seeds. Why do we find them so interesting? It's because they share a lot of characters with what we think an early flowering plant might look like. This is important because in botany and in paleobotany, we are still trying to find the ancestors and closest relatives of the flowering plants. It's a very important group. It dominates the ecosystems today, and we're still not sure where they're coming from. So having these plants from the Triassic, even if it's a long time before the appearance of the first flowering plants, sharing some characters with them, this is pretty exciting. So you see that we can have an idea of the diversity of plants that were growing in Antarctica during the Triassic. We know their importance for plant evolution. There are some other major questions that we are addressing with this research on Antarctic plants. One major question is, what are the changes between the Permian and the Triassic? You know probably that the end of the Permian is marked by a very big extinction event. It's actually the biggest in the history of life. A lot of animals died, but we're still not really sure what happened globally with the plants at this time. In Antarctica, we have the chance to have late Permian deposits and Triassic deposits. So we're trying to see how things change for the plants between these two periods. In the late Permian, we have one group, the Glossopterids, that is very abundant, but not a lot of diversity for the rest of the plants. These Glossopterids, they disappear at the end of the Permian. And then in the Triassic, you have the flora that I've described, with conifer, corystosperms, diversity of ferns, etc. So now we are working closer to the boundary, trying to find out exactly what happens with the plants after this Permian extinction event. Another major research question that we are addressing with this research is what type of plants can grow at high latitudes under a warmer climate. The plants from the Triassic of Antarctica, these big trees that form forests, they were growing at a paleolatitude of about 70 degrees. That's well inside the polar circle. Today, at these latitudes, you find some isolated trees growing in Siberia, but you don't find this type of forests. And these plants that are growing today at high latitudes, they have a major constraint, and that is the cold. The cold in winter, they cannot grow, it's too cold. The plants that were growing in Antarctica during the Triassic, they did not have this problem. The climate was relatively mild, but the thing is they still had to adapt to something that happens when you are at high latitudes. And this is the difference in light regime. You know that as you go towards the pole, the light regime becomes more strict. There are more differences between winter and summer. In the summer, you can have several months of constant daylight. By the way, this is when we are going to the field, when we have 24 hours of daylight. But the major problem for the plants was likely the polar winter, because during the polar winter, you have several months of complete darkness. And you know plants need light to do their photosynthesis. This is how they produce their energy. So even if it was not too cold to grow during the polar winters of the Triassic, the plant still had a bad season, a dark season, where they could not grow. Today, with our climate warming, we are of course wondering how plants are going to colonize the high latitudes. And looking at these plants from the past that were growing in these very unusual conditions, we are hoping to get clues to understand what will happen to forests in the future at high latitudes. What type of plants, how will they function, this kind of questions. Now, I think we've seen there's a lot of interesting things we know about the Triassic plants from Antarctica. Of course, there's still a lot of fossils to discover and a lot of fossils that have been collected and still need to be studied. So hopefully in the coming years, you will see new information about this. And this is really important to understand the past of our planet, but also what could happen in the future. With this, I'm going to thank you for your attention, thank the organizers for inviting me, and I will wish you a good day. Bye!